For today is, this house would trade rights for security. I repeat, this house would trade rights for security.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you've probably heard already, the motion for today is somewhat daunting. It might sound a bit technical, but hopefully this side of the house will be the one to lead you through the motion clearly and slowly. Now, on the way to Forum Galleria this morning, I heard on BBC that India was in fact destabilized by riots against peace talks with Pakistan, which resulted in 36 people injured and 14 dead, ladies and gentlemen. Now, India, ladies and gentlemen, and this is the key point, is one of the countries with the most liberal rights in the world. And yet what we see is this anarchy resulting destabilization and chaos. So what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is in cases like this, we would indeed advocate that we trade rights for security. Now, just to move on to the definitions of the key terms in today's debate. We define rights as natural privileges, but of course this does not mean that they cannot be circumscribed. In fact, historically, they have been and can be circumscribed in certain circumstances. Now, for the purposes of today's debate, the examples of rights we're going to be talking about are pretty basic. Basically, we're talking about the right to strike, the right to privacy, and the right to certain judicial rights that Jolene will be elaborating on later. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that the wording of today's motion requires there to be a clash in the first place, or a kind of division and dichotomy between the rights or the freedoms to liberty and freedom of speech and such things like that, and the right to security, ladies and gentlemen. So only in cases where there is clash, we say we would indeed sacrifice human rights for security. Now, we define security as a state where social stability and people's well-being is protected. And of course, as good debaters, we have a yardstick. And the yardstick is significant threat to the general populace. However, ladies and gentlemen, this will be judged from a reasonable person's perspective of what is disorder, what is chaos, what is danger. So kindly we ask the opposition not to quibble about this yardstick. Now, moving on to our clarifications.
Point, madam.
Yes, madam.
Rather, I tell you, by removing such rights, you're only going to result in further backlash and further threats to your own security.
No, madam. What we see is that we are in fact circumscribing certain rights in the short term so that there can be long-term stability, in which case even more rights and liberties can be given to the people so that their well-being will be promoted. Now, to move on with my clarifications. Just because we are trading certain rights for security doesn't mean that the government is going to run amok and go around depriving everybody of all their rights. Of course, for the purposes of today's debate, certain fundamental rights are going to be irrelevant, such as the right to life, since it would be pretty nonsensical to argue that we would trade the right to life for security. So basically, we are going to limit the rights we're talking about to these few areas. Now, secondly, we do anticipate that the opposition is going to scream governmental abuse and suppression. So what we're going to say is that no, there is going to be an avenue for international recourse, i.e., even if the government has the right to control certain rights, if they abuse that privilege, the international community will in fact step in. NGOs will also step in and apply pressure to ensure that this abuse does not get out of hand. Now, moving on to my case split, as first speaker, I will be talking about, in general, the principle of why rights should be traded for security. And later on, I'll be focusing on the third world. Jolene, as second speaker, will be talking about the first world scenario. So, ladies and gentlemen, in general, why do we say that rights can be traded for security? Well, we have to understand that this whole notion of rights in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, is one that was given in times of security. Without security, there is no means of enforcing or guaranteeing your rights in the first place. Which means that you will have theoretically a whole spectrum of rights, no thank you madam, a whole spectrum of rights, but no means of guaranteeing them in the chaos and anarchy that results, ladies and gentlemen. Thus what we see is a trade-off. Indeed, a trade-off that is entrenched in jurisprudence. For example, Lord Justice Hobhouse from the 1820s has already recognized that under certain scenarios, you will indeed allow for the trade-off of rights. Also, it is a matter of daily acceptance. Ladies and gentlemen, it's often said that there are two things in life that one cannot escape. The first is death. We won't be talking about that. The second is taxation, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, you probably will not know about taxation, but we will all have to know about it sooner or later. And the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, taxation is the social acceptance of the notion that the government can circumscribe your right to property in exchange for the provision of an atmosphere of security and stability, ladies and gentlemen. So in general, what do we see? In general, we see that this idea of the trade-off of rights for security is well entrenched and well accepted. So, as I promised, I'll be moving on to the third world. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have to understand about the third world nowadays is that it suffers from economic deprivation, GNP per capita or income below 800, and low life expectancy, high infant mortality, etc., etc. We all know the dire statistics. But ladies and gentlemen, what we have to recognize is that if the third world populace is given the right to strike, to demonstrate, to protest, what will happen is that the country will be paralyzed with strikes, as has happened in countries, for example, India, where strikes about the price of onions can in fact paralyze the country for days, ladies and gentlemen. What results from this? What results from this is social instability, injuries, loss of life. Also, what results is tremendous economic loss, ladies and gentlemen. Each day of strike, a person of the third world loses approximately $1 of income, which may not sound like a huge deal, but I assure you it is a very important thing to the poor third world farmer. Now, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, in cases like this, where economic prosperity and economic progress is in fact threatened, we would circumscribe such things as the rights to protest and demonstrate, especially since it might in fact endanger the foreign direct investment in the country. And don't you agree, madam?
No, I don't. Tell us, madam, how you plan to remove rights which is going to successfully solve your problem of riots and threats to society.
No, madam, what we're saying is that the right itself to strike and disrupt society at will over such things as the price of onions should be circumscribed temporarily in cases where the economic progress and stability of a country is being threatened. I find that an extremely clear and simple point to grasp. Now, since, ladies and gentlemen, foreign direct investment also depends on the stability of the country. For example, we see in Peru that when there were strikes crippling the country's economic situation, foreign direct investment went down by a whopping 33% during the entire period, ladies and gentlemen. We see indeed that the economic implications of giving people such rights when they're not ready for it is indeed a huge, huge thing that we have to consider. And so, ladies and gentlemen, because of the general principle and because in certain circumstances it is indeed beneficial for the third world to have the certain rights circumscribed in the first place, we would indeed exchange rights for security. My second speaker will go on to show you how the world has changed after September 11th, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure I do not need to elaborate on this point, but she will be telling you how politically certain rights have to be circumscribed because the very social fabric that we live in nowadays is being threatened by dangerous elements, ladies and gentlemen. The case indeed lies with this side of the house.
Alright, you can hear me. Members of this house, what is going to be best to uphold our security? What will best ensure our human dignity? Because at the end of it all, we must realize that really is the end aim of something like upholding collective security, something that will protect our common human dignity and welfare, which is what this side of the house is going to be talking about. But we'd like to ask members of this house this question: what is going to be the best way to bring about this dignity? What is the best way to bring about the security? And we will tell you that creating rights for our security is not the staircase upward that elevates us, that side of the house would have, but is rather a downward spiral into even more anarchy and even more unsettlement and more instability. But before we go on to talk further on that, let's just look at the two main points that side of the house felt was relevant in today's debate. Now, firstly is the idea that they said very nicely, we'll circumscribe certain rights in the short term. Two very interesting qualifiers in their point here, members of this house. So firstly, let's look at the first one. We'll circumscribe certain rights. But members of this house, the type of rights which they have talked about Rights to free speech, for example, rights to protest are the sort of rights that are absolutely fundamental to the functioning of a democracy, which I assume when you bring up India is what the scope of this debate is going to be about. And I would put forth to you that one of the reasons that India is respected as being the world's biggest democracy is because people there and companies there are allowed to have this freedom of speech, no thank you Calvin, that you feel is so essential to be taking away in order to assure our collective security. Rather, I would put forth to you, no thank you, and I will go on to say that because these certain rights are in fact fundamental to the functioning of a democracy, that makes it even more vital that they should not be taken away in order to protect our individual security, our collective security, and at the end, our holistic societal welfare. Which again, no thank you sir, is about what today's debate is about. Secondly was the idea that we take it away in the short term. But really, who is going to decide the period of this short term? When are you going to return it? How are you going to take it away? How are you going to make sure that people are still going to practice their own certain rights to security? You never once told us that. No thank you. No thank you. We tell you, in fact, that what you do have is a situation of simply handing the government a blank check, leading to even more abuse and precedent in the long term. No thank you. The long term, which I would tell you, is what should be considered when one wants to put in place a policy as severe as something the proposition wants. But really, let's then go on to the second point. The interesting point was that on India, members of this House, they then told us that India is presently being paralyzed by strikes because people have this freedom of protest, this freedom of speech. We will put forth to you, like we already have, that the way to deal with this problem is to tighten policing. The way to deal with this, members of this House, is not to remove these rights. No thank you, because I would put forth to you that that would cause even more problems on the part of people. You will be paralyzed by even more protest and even more instability if you're going to take away these people's rights. You tell us that foreign direct investment in a country depends on a country's stability. But we would put forth to you that foreign direct investment also depends on the level of human rights records in a country. And you are not going to tell me that investors would actually want to go in and set up in a country, no thank you, that institutionalizes the removal of rights in order to put up some sort of holistic welfare security point, which they haven't really put forth clearly to us in any case on this side of the House. No thank you. So really, let's go on to what this side of the House is going to talk about. And what we'd like to make very clear on our side here, members of this House, is that we are not the anarchists that the proposition says that we are. We are not saying that we're going to let people run completely amok and make this place even worse than it is. What we are saying is that we will still have provisions for security, which I'm going to elaborate on further in my case. Because on this side, we believe, members of this House, that you can still achieve security without removing your human rights. And that is what I'm going to talk about in today's case. Because I'm going to talk about our rights being the foundation stone of our human dignity. I'm then going to talk about the long-term erosion of our freedoms that takes place if we follow what the proposition says. And Sushant will talk about the resultant backlash that occurs, thereby threatening our security and going against what we want in the first place. So let's just look at the first idea. Yes, Calvin?
Madam, the motion demands of us to make sure that rights and security are two mutually exclusive elements whereby there will be a clash in the circumstances, madam. You are co-opting.
Thank you very much. Calvin, you feel that it says that there should be a clash between the two. But we are going to show you, if you would just listen, and there is no need to abrogate and circumscribe rights in order to assure human security. If you would just listen for a moment, sir, we would tell you that we're not saying that the entire ambit of our human rights have never ever been controlled. What we are saying is that there are some rights that have never ever been controlled by the government due to the fact that they are fundamental to our human dignity. Which rights am I talking about? Very similar to the ones you have talked about, rights to privacy, association, so on and so forth. What we would put forth to you is the idea of why are these rights so vital to our human dignity. We would tell you that this is because they are the cornerstones of our democracy. We need the freedom of speech. We need the recourse to legal representation. No thank you. In order to be active participants in democracies. No thank you. Because we tell you, we need to know. No thank you. We have recourse to the law. We need to know that we can voice our discontent in order to maintain our individual dignity, in order to have our collective security, members of this House. So therefore we would tell you that we would not trade our rights for security because this would compromise our very human dignity, members of this House. No thank you, something which I will not stand up here and argue for. But when we look at the second point under this is the idea of the long-term erosion of freedoms. Because I would ask you that there are several questions the government therefore has to answer. What is a threat to security? What rights will be taken away? And when, members of this House, when will this stop? What is the end point of the policy that the proposition is putting forth? These are the sort of questions the government has to answer in this policy, and we tell you that we don't want a situation like this. We don't want to give the government the weapon of being able to stand up in front of us. No, thank you, Julie. And saying that we need our rights to be removed in order for our security. Because as we know, the two are not mutually exclusive. You can still protect security, members of this House, by still protecting people's rights. Therefore, we will tell you that if you want to remove our rights for security, yes, madam.
I'll give you a very simple case then. What if a terrorist is planning some kind of secret attack on a government? Then would you say, would you still give him his human dignity, his right to privacy as you call it?
Madam, you're talking about a very extreme circumstance. We aren't asking you to look at the very realistic situation. Yes, if there is a threat to security, of course the usual situations, the usual mechanisms we do have of policing and of investigation are naturally going to still be there. We are not, however, going to allow you to take away our basic rights to the invasion of our privacy, our freedom of movement, and our legal representation, because that is something which will lead to a dangerous precedent to members of this House, and we don't want to embark on that downward road. We tell you, members of this House, when you look, for example, at examples of Pinochet and Peron, who both started out, just like you would say, as democratic leaders, but over the course of removal of rights for national security, as I like to call it, they became tin pot dictators with death squads, and we don't want this, members of this House. We don't want to descend into that spiral of simply allowing the removal completely of all our rights. So we say, don't sign yourself off to this death pact.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you one very fundamental question. And that question is, what is dignity, ladies and gentlemen? Is dignity the ability to be cited approvingly in some first world academician's paper as being a haven for human rights? Or is dignity the ability to fill your stomach? Is dignity the ability to walk out on the street and not be faced with people rioting with threats to your life? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to put it forward to you that security is a far more fundamental precondition of human dignity than the high-flown liberties that they talk about. So first of all, I'm going to look at Rohini's arguments for today. The idea that these individual liberties are cornerstones of democracy. And ladies and gentlemen, you notice that essentially all she's told us is she's asserted again and again and again that these things are very important, that these things are fundamental, that these things cannot be derogated from. And ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that we only agree up to a certain point, because Penny has spent her entire speech proving to you how there are circumstances in which the right to strike, in which the right to protest and to demonstrate, in fact, does infringe upon people's ability to fill their stomachs, does infringe upon their ability to enjoy economic security. And we're going to tell you that compared to these very real, tangible benefits, no thank you madam, all your high-flown words and your high-flown notions just don't cut it. Now, they ask us what rights and when.
Point, madam.
No, thank you, sir. And I'm going to tell you that we've already mentioned that we're not going to derogate from such very fundamental rights as the right to be free from torture and the right to be free from being murdered, ladies and gentlemen, because this obviously isn't going to take us anywhere. They ask us how we're going to guarantee that only these rights are protected while other rights are derogated from, and we say it's very simple. We say there's a fundamental difference between the government being able to send its police forces out to stop a strike, and the government sending its police forces into their homes to capture you and take you away and brand you and do nasty things to you, ladies and gentlemen. We think the distinction is obvious to any ordinary human being. We think the distinction, no thank you madam, is obvious to all of you out there. And we think the distinction is also obvious to groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who actually go to these countries and actually investigate the procedures of the government. No thank you madam. For example, by uncovering things such as prison abuse in Algeria, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that there are plenty of safeguards to make sure that the extent to which the derogation of right occurs is not an excessive one. They ask us furthermore when these rights are going to be returned, and we tell you it's very simple. In the case of these third world countries, when these these people are able to fill their stomachs, when there's a development of a middle class, ladies and gentlemen, who would naturally be interested in the furtherance of these things, when these people are no longer concerned the day-to-day struggle to simply survive, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that they will stand up and ask for their rights. Yes, madam.
54 years of independence for India, madam, and still no sufficient middle class. Are you going to dictate the rights
and
for
the
that period?
precise reason why India doesn't have a sufficient middle class is because, as we pointed out, you've given them all these rights, which has stymied the economic development. I'm not sure what you intend to prove by bringing up this example, since we just brought up that very same example and dedicated a lot of time to showing you how that is a place where the provision of rights has in fact jeopardize security, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm really not sure what you're trying to prove. I will point you to the example of Singapore, where now that we've grown and we've developed and there's a large middle class, we see that now there are things such as this very debate that are being held here, that people are beginning to discuss such issues that were not discussed before. I'm also going to say briefly that their point about policing, about the way to deal with unrest being policing, is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. Because when people have a right to strike, when they have a right to demonstrate, when they have a right to protest, that means effectively that people can enforce this right against the government. The government cannot send in policemen to stop these people unless they're actively being violent. No, thank you, sir. And we tell you that they don't need to be violent for investors to be scared away. All they need to do is refuse to work. All they need to do is fill the streets, ladies and gentlemen. So we tell you that this idea of policing really doesn't stand. No, thank you, sir. So having dealt with the complete rubbish that they've given us today, I'm now going to move on to further my constructive case. And it's very interesting that Mohini called terrorism an extreme case and said that we could deal with it with the usual mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen. Because the very essence of the world today, after September 11th, ladies and gentlemen, is that the world we are living is an extreme one, and the usual mechanisms are insufficient, ladies and gentlemen. So while Peggy has talked to you about the security threat that faces third world countries of not having, let's say, economic security, I'm going to tell you about the security threat facing the first world. Surprise, surprise, terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. And what I'm going to tell you today is that the magnitude of the threat that we face today is such that it demands a shift in our conception of an ideal constitutional balance, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that the cost of unbridled freedom after the attacks on the World Trade Center have now been seen to run into thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent lives, ladies and gentlemen. There are thousands of innocent men, women, and children, your family members, your friends, ladies and gentlemen. These are the people who are at risk. So I'm going to tell you that after this, we need to have a change in the way that we do the judicial process. Yes, why do you tell us about it, madam?
Madam, why can't you simply handle these problems by tightening things like airport security checks, which is a fundamental reason why the problem occurred in the first place?
I'm about to tell you why. The reason why you can't do it is because of the nature of the terrorist threat. And first of all, I'm going to tell you why we need to have detention without trial. Because I'm going to tell you that the nature of evidence relating to planned terrorist attacks is that it lies below the space occupied by quote proof beyond reasonable doubt, unquote. What we have to go on now is reasonable suspicion because of the nature of evidence which relates to terrorist attacks. Because it is such that it is often circumstantial. Things like links to terrorist organizations, things like trips to those tourist havens, those wonderful destinations of Afghanistan and Sudan, ladies and gentlemen, which everybody will be going to for innocent, ordinary purposes. Things like taking flight lessons for absolutely no apparent reason, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that none of this satisfies the criteria of beyond reasonable doubt, but it is reasonable suspicion. And we tell you that in order to be able to gain sufficient evidence to convict these people, we need to temporarily detain them without trial. Now this is important not only to facilitate the gathering of more information, but also to incapacitate them. Because, no thank you, madam, a successful terrorist attack is going to cost you thousands and thousands of lives. So we tell you that prevention, that incapacitation, that making sure they can't even move is more important in this case than in the case of an ordinary crime, ladies and gentlemen. And that is how it is special. That is how it differs. I'm going to tell you furthermore that even in such a situation, you can still have a review by judges in a closed session, ladies and gentlemen. You can still have invited members of human rights organizations to go in and look at what is happening here. So it's not true that the government can just run amok and abuse this willy-nilly. I'm going to tell you furthermore that the right to trial by jury is something else that people would have to sacrifice. I'm going to tell you that open trials result in the exposure of intelligent sources and methods. And this is extremely dangerous in a time when being able to track these people is the most important thing. We tell you that's what happened when America released its information about its satellite methods after the bombing of the US embassies, ladies and gentlemen. And it's this that led directly to the lack of intelligence about the planned operations of Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, whatever, on September 11th. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you that this is why the attitude in the world now, after September 11th, was one of acceptance of America's assurance that there was evidence, and some closed evidence, there's some evidence shown to government officials behind closed doors instead of being brought out in the open. I'm going to tell you that everybody respects the fact that the world has changed, and if the opposition doesn't, we suggest they learn to do so soon.
They ask us, what is human dignity? Well, we have clearly told you, human dignity is simply this, a combination of security and rights. And what the opposition tells you today is that there is no need to give up your rights to achieve this sort of certain security, which you won't really achieve in the first place because of the counterproductive nature of you removing the rights. What you further will result is in further problems of things such as backlash from your grassroots level of people feeling disenfranchised that your government is taking away their rights. What you won't get is achieving your end aims of security which they would like to have. But let us just look, first of all, at the first issue of today's debate, and that is of looking at what Jolie talked about this first world notion of targeting this threat of terrorists. Now, ladies and gentlemen, terrorists, first of all, as Rohini said, are an extreme picture. But let us just go on and look at it as it is, because we have to recognize that it is becoming a bigger problem in America in itself. Now, what we have to see is that we, as the opposition, will stand here and tell you that the right to a proper and fair trial still have to be granted to the people you are detaining. You can't simply remove their right to a fair trial simply because you have this threat of terrorists, because by doing that, you are resulting in further problems for your country. For example, your very American people, the country in which you are removing these rights in the first place, are having severe backlash against the government for detaining these people without trial because they feel that it's a constitutional right being taken away from the people, and they are afraid at which point is the government actually going to stop? Whose rights are they actually going to take away? Because I tell you the truth of the matter right now is this. Somebody's mother's brother's sister who's lying on the bar 2 miles away from where the plane crash took place is actually being detained. Now this might seem very funny, but that is the truth of the matter. If you actually tune into CNN for less than 5 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, you would actually find out that this threat is very serious. That is exactly why the main backlash that is being faced in America is because of these problems. And they say they're going to judge this on this whole notion of reasonable suspicion. But what is reasonable suspicion? What are your barriers that constitute reasonable suspicion? When are you going to say that someone is actually supposed to be connected with the crimes and when someone is not? Because from your own criteria, you say that someone was actually learning how to fly a plane who happened to be a Muslim at the same time was supposedly involved in the terrorist attacks. Now such arbitrary mechanisms to judge whether someone is of reasonable suspicion doesn't seem to be really working in the world at all. And there are ways to control it. International checks, ladies and gentlemen. International checks. After the United States of America has been thrown off the Human Rights Council, they still have no qualms about increasing the widening of their powers to have more rights being taken away from the people, even though they're facing more backlash. And tell me, will your NGOs actually be willing to stand up to such a big country, such as the United States, and tell them, listen, what you're doing is actually wrong, and through my investigations, I found out that you're actually taking away too many rights. So you better stop now, or I will somehow enforce my powers on you. What powers? We don't actually know. So let us just look at the second point of what this whole notion of an end point and the slippery slope argument. Well, they tell you it's when the third world develops a middle class. And when I point of information here on the whole notion of India, well, they said exactly because they've never always had their rights being upheld. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us just take them on their own grounds and for 1 second say you curb the rights. Now, even if you said India would have been able to develop within 25 years, are you going to tell me that for that period of 25 years, you're going to remove the rights of these people? I have halved it for you from 52 to 25, and you still tell me you're going to remove the rights for this period of time. And furthermore, you're telling me people who are actually rioting now because of the fact that their government is trying to make conciliatory moves with Pakistan, they are not going to somehow riot when you remove their fundamental right to strike, one of the pillars on which India's democracy has been built for the last 52 years. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, you are absolutely mistaken. Yes, sir.
Yes, madam, but by removing the right to strike, what you're enabling the state to do is to come down with measures to clamp down on these suppressions and to furthermore increase the economic stability of the region.
Thank you, sir. I tell you, the measures you should be implementing is tighter policing. I don't see the necessity for you to remove a fundamental right to achieve this this arbitrary aim of stopping riots. Now let us just look at what my case is supposed to be about today. This whole notion of backlash threatening security. Now this nicely ties on to actually what I was just dealing with in my own rebuttals. Now basically, the end point, as we've already established for today's debate, is human dignity. I said it constitutes both security as well as rights. Now in my substantive, I will show you how removing these very rights threatens this very security, which the proposition today would like to achieve. Now why is this fundamentally so? Well, it's basically because of this. When you actually remove these rights, what you're having is further backlash, which is going to result at your grassroots levels. Because inherent in many democracies, even though you and I may not really be totally able to relate to this, people do highly value their own libertarian attitudes to life. They value the fact that they have certain rights which do not fall under the control and ambit of the government. And that is something we inherently have to respect in today's world. Yes, madam?
Explain then the soaring popularity of George Bush and his Gallup polls that show widespread support for his measures of reducing civil liberties, madam.
No, madam. Rather, I tell you, it's not so. What George Bush's popularity is based on is the fact that he has taken a hardline stand against Afghanistan. Not so much that he's removing his civil liberties. For that, there is in fact a lot of backlash taking place in the United States of America. Various countries like UK, France, and America are countries in which situations where people actually respect this whole notion of civil liberties being granted to them. Now, what will actually happen if you actually remove these civil liberties under this name of security? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I tell you, it's exactly like that baby. As that baby is crying today, these people are going to cry on the streets because they are disillusioned and disenfranchised that their government is going to give up their rights. And this disenfranchisement does not only come from the loss of faith in the government, but also because of the fact that these measures in previous cases have proved to be completely ineffective. And when they're ineffective, and furthermore there's a distrust in the government, what you in fact have is a situation of disillusionment, a situation of backlash, and a situation of general tension in the country, which is going to go back threatening your security. And let's just see this in a couple of examples. For example, when we actually see within Indonesia, when they actually remove the people's powers, or when they actually remove people's rights, in many cases, what we actually saw was backlash on the part of the people. You can also see this in an example of London under the Big Brother syndrome. What we actually saw was when they implemented digital face recognition cameras, what you actually saw was great backlash on the part of the people, not only because their privacy was being threatened, but because this mechanism failed to target the two terrorists who were involved in the September 11th attacks. Now explain to me the effectiveness of your digital face recognition and invasion of privacy if it doesn't really tackle the problem and results in further backlash. This is also seen in a more moderate example if you want to talk about the United States of America, where they keep extending their powers to include new rights, which is still facing further backlash and riots on the part of the people, with only 16.3% of the American population actually supporting George Bush's move. Therefore, clearly, ladies and gentlemen, there's something inherently and fundamentally wrong with removing people's rights. Do not go with the way of the proposition, respect rights and respect security. Both can go hand in hand.
Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The problem with the opposition today, ladies and gentlemen, is that they are too idealistic. What is wrong with that, and how will I deal with it? Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we'll talk about their understandings of the notions of democracy and how they are flawed, ladies and gentlemen, and why, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, that side of the house is right. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, let's deal with the whole idealism point, which that side of the house has brought up regarding FDI, terrorism, and the whole notion whereby security and liberty can go together hand in hand. Last and not least, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the smallest point that they have raised so far, the whole notion of ineffectiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, because these 3 points concur, that side of the house movement cannot stand. Firstly, democracy, ladies and gentlemen, that side of the house asserts to us continuously that democracy needs preservation of these rights. Ladies and gentlemen, in the long run, this side of the House agrees with you that democracy needs the preservation of these rights in order to work. However, ladies and gentlemen, when there is a clash between the need for security and the need for democracy, need for rights, ladies and gentlemen, in especially the third world, which that side of the House has raised, obviously the need for security must take precedent. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Let me quote Samuel P. Huntington, the foremost modernization theories of democracy in the world today. What he says, ladies and gentlemen, is that there needs to be a certain level of economic activity and economic progress and social stability before this environment is conducive for the establishment of democracy. Now, if no such environment is created, ladies and gentlemen, as with the case of India, where you give them these so-called rights to strike, rights to liberty, rights to protest, when the environment does not establish a conducive environment for economic progress, does not establish an environment, a conducive environment for economic improvement, ladies and gentlemen, what you have is two classes, one entrenched in poverty and one very rich. There is no middle class, there is no establishment of civil society, and ladies and gentlemen, there will be no democracy as we know it. Yes, sir.
When you remove people's rights, such as in Bandar Aceh 2 days ago, leading to widespread riots and chaos, is that how you increase foreign direct investment and stability?
Come on, ladies and gentlemen, the only notion which the third world individuals know of is that of an empty stomach. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't really care whether or not they have the right to protest. Ladies and gentlemen, their only concern, ladies and gentlemen, good economic policy of improvement. Ladies and gentlemen, stabilizes the social arena of society. Ladies and gentlemen, if the government guarantees you the economic improvement that we talk about, we, ladies and gentlemen, will not see the so-called escalating violence that they talk about when you remove civil liberties. Ladies and gentlemen, they are not concerned about civil liberties. Rather, I propose to you, if you establish and make known the whole notion of civil liberties to these entrenched poor individuals in the third world who have no necessary education to comprehend the idea of civil liberties, what you will do is give them a greater excuse, greater leverage to protest, ladies and gentlemen, to create even a more escalating cycle of violence. Ladies and gentlemen, in the long run, by giving them these civil liberties that they talk about, the whole notion of the removal of violence is therefore forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, where is the logic? Not there whatsoever. Let's move on, ladies and gentlemen, on the whole notion. I'm sorry.
You seem to think that all my poor brothers and sisters in India only value their bellies, but that is not it. They also value their rights. The moment you face further backlash,
Yes,
deal with that,
in
sir.
India today, they value their rights. Why? Because you have given them the civil liberties to begin with. Because, ladies and gentlemen, they know about it. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't really care if you are part of the third world who haven't had knowledge of these so-called civil liberties. Where is the development? Ladies and gentlemen, this leads to a cycle of escalating violence, ladies and gentlemen. This is what it happens. No, thank you, madam. Now let's talk about the examples of Pinochet and Peron. They say that yes, by taking away, what happens is in the cases of Pinochet and Peron, where they are democratically elected, or Hitler's, or another example being Hitler, democratically elected, they take away, ladies and gentlemen, the civil liberties, therefore leading to escalating violence. Now in the first place, if these poor countries do not have the civil liberties that they talk about, are not concerned, ladies and gentlemen, with these so-called civil liberties, this so-called notion of democracy, ladies and gentlemen, these people would not have been in power. These people would not have been dictators, ladies and gentlemen. Where is the avenue for them to go into power if these people do not have the knowledge of such? Ladies and gentlemen, obviously they don't understand what the notion of democracy is and how it works and what is the necessary environment that makes it conducive for the establishment of democracy. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the whole notion of idealism. That's how the House says this today, that security can go hand in hand with the establishment of freedoms, of our values, of our rights. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, the whole idea of terrorism. I accuse them of hypocrisy. They say terrorism is an extreme example, whereby when the situation warrants it, inherently what they're saying is, if the situation warrants it, we will give up our security for our rights. Ladies and gentlemen, that's inherently what the first speaker and the second speaker on that side of the House has stated throughout. When there is a clash, ladies and gentlemen, between the whole notion of security and the notion of rights, that security should take precedence over that of rights. Ladies and gentlemen, that side of the House has inherently agreed with us. But furthermore, thank you, madam. Furthermore, they talk about, ladies and gentlemen, India, that if, ladies and gentlemen, there is a need for it, we can always increase policing. Now, the problem here is that by guaranteeing their rights, by guaranteeing constitutionally their rights of protest, of public demonstrations. What can the police do? The police cannot do anything. The police can stand around the edges and look at them, shaking their bonbons and moving up their shaking their bonbons and moving up their placards and banners, but they can't do anything. Ladies and gentlemen, that being the case, you have rendered the police ineffective. You have rendered the state ineffective. You have rendered all security measures ineffective. What are the rights you are talking about, ladies and gentlemen? Where is the escalating violence? It only lies in guaranteeing these people's rights, ladies and gentlemen, in a situation where security is warranted. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, the whole idea of foreign direct investment. Ladies, they say that people don't care about economic stability. They tell us that human rights is one of the predominant factors whereby foreign direct investment moves into a country. Ladies and gentlemen, I say come back to the real world. Come on, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, that explains why Nike moved into the third world to exploit them. Gee, social security, ladies and gentlemen, but not economic viability. Bollocks. That is not how it happens, ladies and gentlemen. MNCs move in because, ladies and gentlemen, of the fact that there is social security and there is an environment conducive for the establishment of economic progress. Now, this whole human rights notion might be a modern new thing, and I suggest to you that it is merely a facade of the MNCs to increase its marketability, where at the bottom of it all, they are still exploiting the third world, ladies and gentlemen. They are still paying them wages that are a small percentage of what exactly the first world workers get. So, ladies and gentlemen, where is this whole idea whereby MNCs move in because of the notion of rights? Whereby MNCs move in because, yes, we want to be humane. Ladies and gentlemen, I tell you, come back to the real world. That side of the house lives in limbo. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, in conclusion, we have shown you on that side of the house that firstly, they don't understand the notions of democracy, they don't understand the conducive environment for democracy, they don't understand how to establish a democracy. Furthermore, they're idealistic by giving us examples of which they don't understand the reasons behind, and they tell us, ladies and gentlemen, that these reasons are concretely and supposedly what happens in the real world, and I have shown you that is contrary, and obviously that being the case, this side of the house must stand.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are suffering from low pay, if you are oppressed by your employers, and you want to strike, the proposition today tells you in no way can you do that. They want to oppress this very right, this very fundamental right of you to voice your protest and your disapproval, and they expect you to take this lying down. They expect you to accept it hands on. We tell you this is not the case. Before moving on to the three major points of today's debate, let us now get two things out of the way. First of all, they tell us that this debate is about when there is a clash, which one do we choose? We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the proposition today cannot assume that once there is a clash and security and trade and the trading of rights come into balance, that once we trade the rights, we will eventually have security. They have to concretely prove to us that this will occur, and this has not been done throughout their three speakers. They've merely asserted that this is possible. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, they tell us that this abrogation of rights is only in the short term. However, ladies and gentlemen, they have not shown us in any way how this right has been returned in any examples when governments, when they take away their rights, finally return these rights. We tell you that historical precedent shows us that when governments take away their rights, they don't return it, ladies and gentlemen. The Ayatollah of Iran took away certain rights in the start, in the 1970s, and never returned it. In fact, it led to a slippery slope, which I will elaborate on later on.
No, sir.
And last of all, ladies and gentlemen, they talked about just certain rights being taken away, such as the rights to protest, the rights to free speech. However, we tell you that these are extremely critical rights. For instance, your right to voice your own protest, and they are inalienable. And other rights hinges on these particular rights. So if you take away these important rights, you are indirectly undermining the very other rights which your life is based on. Now, having clarified these things out of the way, let me now move on to the three important things which I want to talk about. First of all, this whole notion that abrogating of rights in the third world is beneficial. Second of all, that we should take away rights in the first world for greater security. And last of all, this small point about checks and balances. Moving right on to the first point. They tell us, ladies and gentlemen, that in order to preserve stability in the third world, we need to take away people's rights. We need to remove their rights for protest because this will lead to an increase in foreign direct investment. Ladies and gentlemen, we assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that they have merely assumed that by taking away people's rights to protest, it will solve the problem of discontent. We tell you that this is a way of sweeping the problem under the carpet. They are saying that we will ignore your discontent. We will not bother about the fact that you are unhappy, you have low pay. We will just oppress you and prevent you from speaking out. And ladies and gentlemen, they are assuming that this will lead to stability. We point you to the fact that in Bangladesh, Noam Jolie, we point you to the fact that in Bangladesh, when Sheikh Hasina did this very act of stopping people from protesting because of low pay, it led to a very dire backlash in which people took to the streets and protested against the government for doing such a dire thing as to take away their fundamental right to voice their disapproval. We tell you that their idea of safeguarding security is counterproductive because not only are you not going to safeguard the security, you're going to anger people and entrench instability. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that in Bangladesh, when Sheikh Hasina did that in 1992, foreign direct investment dropped by 39%, and we asked them, ladies and gentlemen, to account for the fact that that move by Sheikh Hasina actually led to such a dire outcome.
Point of information.
Yes, Jolie.
Explain the fact that it wasn't until the economic crisis which precipitated the collapse of the economy in Indonesia that people protested against Suharto, sir.
Well, madam, what we tell you is that in Suharto, it is firstly not a democracy in which he ruled under an iron fist. But the point, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you try to impose upon people, and in a democracy such as in Bangladesh, when you try to impose upon people and strip away their right to protest, people are not going to take it lying down. They will protest, they will stand up, they will cause increased instability. Furthermore, when we talk about the third world, we tell you that the human rights records in the third world are of critical importance for foreign direct investment. And when you abrogate people's rights, you are going to cause these third world countries to drastically drop on the human rights indicators in today's world. And in the first world, with an increase in conscience for human rights in the world, which increasingly links trade with human rights, when they drop on human rights indicators, foreign direct investment will decrease, according to even greater detriment in the third world. He talked about Nike and how Nike went into third world countries. But we tell you that in today's world of the human face of capitalism, first world MNCs are increasingly concerned about the fact that the countries in which they invest in have at least a reasonable amount of human rights, or at least moving towards imposing greater human rights. And when this doesn't occur, it will lead to a drop in MNCs and foreign direct investments. So having handled that point, let me now move on to the second point about the notion of the first world.
Information, sir.
No, madam. They talked about how in the first world, in the post-September 11th world, we need increased in attempts to control the widespread insecurity. And they accused us of a contradiction. In no way did we contradict between our two speakers. What we've consistently told you, ladies and gentlemen, is that the problem in the post-September 11th world, or even in the pre-September 11th world, is a problem of lax enforcement of current securities and current laws. So what we're telling you, ladies and gentlemen, is to increase the enforcement of these laws instead of abrogating more rights. For instance, ladies and gentlemen, the problem with September 11th attacks was a lax airport checks, and the investigative journalism just wanted to uncover smuggled knives and mallets through security at Heathrow Airport. So the problem is with lax airport policing and not the rights. And we tell you that when you increase the attempts and increase enforcement, you are going to settle the problem at its root instead of abrogating these rights. When you detain people without trial, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be ineffective because you're going to cause a situation of widespread paranoia. And handle this point about paranoia.
You have never explained to us how the right to trial by jury leads to a direct exposure of intelligence sources and
Thank you very much.
Not going to send
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much. But what we've seen, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you say that a person with a beard, a person who looks like Osama bin Laden, can be detained based on suspicion, you are going to lead to widespread paranoia in the country, in which people are worried that, well, if I have a beard and look faintly like Osama bin Laden, I may be detained. And we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that this will deter investors, this will deter tourists, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is counterproductive to what you are actually trying to do. So we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, for the first world, the way to go is with increased enforcement and existing mechanisms. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, when you impose systems such as detention without trial, you're going to cause your country to diminish your status on the international stage. For instance, the US will decrease their leverage to ask other countries to upkeep their human rights record, and this is against the interest of the First World. Now, having handled the point about the First World, let me now move on to the last small point about checks and balances. What we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that checks and balances via the ways of international recourse, which they talked about, are entirely ineffective. Because when we talk about first world countries, such as the United States, many countries are deterred from having backlash or mechanisms against the United States to punish them for setting up areas such as setting up military tribunals. So even if it is effective, even if some action is taking place, there is no effect to push these first world countries towards reinstating the right. So all in all, ladies and gentlemen, by abrogating people's rights, this is a critical lapse of judgment and a failure by the government to protect the welfare of their citizens. So join us, ladies and gentlemen, in saying no to the abrogation of your rights.
Yep, let me just bring this down to my level here. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of today's debate, we have to realize that both sides here have the same purpose. Both of us want to achieve security, both of us want to achieve human dignity and welfare. But we would put it to you that throughout the course of today's debate, what has evolved is that the proposition is taking a tack that is overzealous and simply saying that we're going to be as paranoid as possible and take away as many rights as possible, where rather we've had on the other side the opposition that chooses to be more pragmatic and more realistic in their approach to bringing about eventual collective security. So with that in mind, let us now look at the two main areas in today's debate. The first one I called, now you see it, now you don't. And this essentially is the idea of what the proposition felt we needed, of taking away some rights in the short term and then giving them back at some peculiar unnamed date. But the idea here, members of this House, firstly, was that when they simply said, we're going to take away certain rights, they never realized what the opposition continually said, is that the certain rights you want to take away are the particular rights which are so fundamental to the working of our democracy, members of this House. The sort of rights that, if taken away, will put us on a dangerous path to the eventual erosion and removal of all these rights, members of this House. We want to start off as the United States, but do we want to end off as Pinochet and Perón's countries? No, we don't. And that really is the problem, that they are not telling you that their problem of taking away rights is simply one end of a scale that will end up in a simply different extreme circumstance. And we say don't even begin the slipping of the scale in that direction in the first place. Now then they tell us we're going to have this in the short term. And continually when we ask them, what is the short term? How long will it last? First they told us, well, it would be obvious because there's a clear distinction. But secondly they told us, well, when we have proper development, well, when we have a middle class and people's bellies are full. But the point that we point out consistently, firstly, is that people also do care. Yes, they are hungry, but they also care about their rights. We pointed out countries like East Timor, which still fight for their independence, even though they still do not have a high level of development. We pointed out countries, for example, like the United States, which have the largest number of trade unions and lobby groups in the whole world, and yet are able to enjoy a high rate of economic development. So consistently we pointed them, firstly, that you don't need to remove rights to ensure economic development, and secondly, that you don't need to remove rights to ensure that all of us, you, me, all of us here are ensured of our security, members of this House. But now that we're on that point, and consistently when we told them that in the end they were simply asking for long-term abuse of precedent, they then went on to tell us, well, you don't see, it's for security. Again, we told them their security was only reached because their security was lax in the first place. A problem which again can be solved by stepping up the enforcement of existing mechanisms. But members of this House, on the second and final point, was the idea of what the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve after. Because they say the whole problem is that we gave them rights in the first place, and because we gave them these rights, we've got no development, we've got no investment, we've got strikes, let's take away all of this for security. And we told them firstly that they're disregarding Sushma's entire case about the backlash that you're going to cause when you have this sort of arbitrary action. And secondly, we we reminded them consistently through the conduit of chimney that we've got the human face of capitalism. We've got people realizing that economic cost is not the only thing that's important, but social cost and human rights records in a country are just as important to investors, are just as important to other countries that want to invest in your country, and not just economic stability that you would like to ask for. We tell you we need to have, for example, like you said, the right to strike to show people that they are able to voice their discontent with the government. So therefore we would ask you, members of this House, to join with the opposition and fight for your right and for your welfare.
I'd like to inform all and sundry that I have not done a reply speech in excess of a year, and it's all her fault here that I'm doing it now. But on a more serious note, there are a couple of things that I have to address in what they brought up today, because it seems to me to reflect a very fundamental misunderstanding of what this debate is about, ladies and gentlemen. Because first of all, they assume to us that when you take away some rights, you have to take away all rights. That there doesn't exist a space between where there are certain rights that are more fundamental. Things like the right to life, things like the right to be free from torture. And there are other rights that in certain situations do need to be interrogated, ladies and gentlemen. They've simply insisted again and again and again that every single right that we have is fundamental, is inalienable, is non-derogable, ladies and gentlemen. And that is one of the problems at the heart of their speeches. But before I move on to summing up some of the other issues, I'd like to point you to a contradiction that occurred in the last opposition speaker, primarily because the second opposition speaker insisted that international pressure and human rights watchdogs were completely ineffective, ladies and gentlemen, that they were unable to do anything at all. Whereas their third speaker came up and said that yes, they are very effective, and once you want to move even slightly from the full extent of human rights, then they will swoop down on you, ladies and gentlemen. We suggest to you that the truth lies in between, that when people take away very, very fundamental rights, like the right to life and the right to be free from torture and degrading treatment, yes, these human rights groups are effective. But we tell you that furthermore, when the rights that have been taken away are those that it is necessary to derogate from, then that doesn't happen. So I just wanted to point you to that contradiction. But moving on to the other aspect of the case, the idea of backlash, ladies and gentlemen. We've told you that in third world countries, people don't really care about human rights. That what's really fundamental to them is the idea of getting enough to eat, of having a safe home, ladies and gentlemen. And they've never challenged our example of Indonesia, of how when people suffered for 30 years of oppression under Suharto, but they didn't suffer because they were economically stable, they couldn't protest. They brought up India, and Kelvin has already told you that the prime reason why these people revolted in India is because people make a big deal out of this paper notion of human rights. These people don't have rights embedded in their everyday consciousness, ladies and gentlemen. It just becomes a political jingoism, a political catchphrase that will allow people, that people use as an excuse to stir up political problems. And we tell you furthermore that there isn't such a backlash in the United States. Because as I pointed out to you, Gallup polls of the American population show that they support such measures. That everybody is deeply horrified by what happened in September 11th, and they recognize the need to do something about it, ladies and gentlemen. And their support is not merely for the war, but also for specific measures removing civil liberties. So I'm going to suggest to you that first of all, on the idea of the inalienable nature of human rights, and second of all, on the idea of a backlash, their case really doesn't stand. But I'd like to point you more pertinently to the fact that they have never once addressed the causal mechanism that we have shown you. The instances where giving rights does directly lead to people not being able to achieve things like a full stomach and a safe home, ladies and gentlemen. We pointed you to the fact that investors don't want people to have the right to strike and the right to demonstrate. And they just claim, no, investors do care about human rights, ladies and gentlemen. All we have is mere assertion against the cold hard logic that if your workers don't work, if your workers are filling the streets and creating a disturbance, ladies and gentlemen, then you're not going to be able to make a profit, and investors don't want that. They've only given us assertion response. They've never dealt with the cold hard logic that when you have the right to free trial by jury and you have the exposure of intelligence sources and methods, ladies and gentlemen, that the terrorist organizations can then circumvent the sort of procedures that you would use to get around that. They've merely insisted that airport security is a problem. And maybe it is a problem, ladies and gentlemen. That doesn't deal with the fact that it's also a problem that you're going around exposing your intelligence sources willy-nilly, and you're going around allowing people for whom you have reasonable suspicion to conduct their affairs freely, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to end here.